All right, so let's talk about the previous lab. We made a dense neural network and it did okay, 9 out of 10 accuracy. Not bad for a machine, but not as good as a human. We also saw that the training accuracy was pretty high, but the validation accuracy was low, which means it probably was overfitting. So today we're going to do something called convolutional neural networks, which is a fun technique which allows our machines to perceive images much more closely to the way that humans do. Sounds pretty cool, right? Okay, let's get going. Before we get into neural networks, let's talk about how computer vision experts used to approach this type of problem. If you played with Photoshop, MS Paint, or GIMP a lot as a kid, making GIFs or GIFs or memes or silly pictures, good news! Understanding how computers represent and manipulate photos is a great foundation for modern-day computer vision. For example, let's take a look at the blur, sharpen, brighten, and darken tools. In a drawing program, the area around where we click that manipulates our image is called the kernel. Convolution is when our kernel is multiplied with our image, and that is what's happening when we select these tools and drag it across our image. To be technical, convolution is when we apply a function to another function, but we could think of our base image and our kernel as functions of pixels and color. The kernel is just a small matrix. Blurring is a weighted average of the numbers that represent the pixel. Sharpen brightens the pixel in the center of it, but subtracts the pixels directly adjacent to it. Brighten makes the center pixel's color values bigger. Okay, so we have a picture of a heart. Not obvious? Sorry, I only had 6 by 6 pixels to work with. We're going to take a step through a convolution. The fancy star in the center is the convolution operator. The resulting image is going to be 4 by 4 pixels. Let's start in the top left corner. We'll call the section that we're about to convolve, the red box here, the window. Notice how it has the same shape as our kernel. We're going to take our kernel and multiply each cell in the kernel with the respective cell in the window. We're then going to total the results of the multiplication. Next, we move the window over by 1, and we repeat the process until we've calculated the convolution for the whole image. There are a few parameters we can play with for convolution. One is the stride, which is by how many pixels we should move our window when doing convolution. Let's chop our heart in half to see what we mean. Oh no, broken heart. Let's assume we have the same kernel as before. With a stride at 2, we skip starting convolution at every other column and every other row. When we do this, we also generate less data, which has pros and cons. The good is that means we have less data to analyze. But if we increase our stride too much, we might miss important information. The other thing to look out for is with a stride at 2, we don't have enough columns to do a convolution for the right side of this image. If we want enough data to make sure all pixels are used in convolution, or if we want the resulting image to be the same size as our input image, we can do something called padding. A quick and easy way to do this is called zero padding, where we add a border of zeros around our image. This can be sufficient in many cases, but in some where the image is small, it can have an impact on the convolution. So, how does this apply to neural networks? Before neural networks, computer vision researchers would play around with the numbers within a kernel to see if it could be used to find any interesting features in the image. So far, we've only used 3 by 3 kernels, but they can be any size, and researchers would try to do things like make a kernel that returned a high value if it convolved a cat ear. So you can have a cat ear kernel, a cat nose kernel, a cat eye kernel, and if you ran all of those through an image and found matches, you might guess that there was a cat. But as neural networks got more and more powerful, people made the connection that, whoa, kernels are these devices that multiply weights to an input and then adds the results together. What else does that? Oh yeah, neurons do that too. That's exactly what convolutional neural networks are. they map the inputs of a neuron to a kernel with trainable weights. This is a convolutional neural network architecture. It is a bit smaller than what we'll be doing in the lab, but the structure is similar. First, we have our input image. We're going to start with a variable number of convolutional layers, in this case, 2 3x3x1 grayscale filters. We can have as many as we want, and each one of them is going to produce a new image by trying to extract interesting features out of the original image. We're going to stack these images on top of each other, so we end up with a three-dimensional image, but not 3D in the way that we humans perceive it. We could then send this new image through a new set of filters. When convolving, even though we're technically doing a 2D convolution because we're in black and white, we're actually convolving a 3D object that is our window size by the number of stacked images. Because we have two stacked images, our kernels are digesting a 3x3x2 slice of the stacked images. And in the picture above, we have two 3x3x2 filters. When we're done convolving, we'll flatten everything out and feed the results through our neural net as normal. It used to be that data scientists would toy around with the kernel sizes, and that's still useful in some cases. But empirically, sticking with 3x3 works well. Let's go back to computer vision theory to understand why. When researchers first came up with these kernels before neural networks, they also realized that you can use them to essentially calculate the derivative of these images. What in the world does that mean? Well, there is a special class of kernels that can pick up edges, places where the change in color of an image is changing rapidly. For instance, the kernel on the left picks up vertical edges and the kernel on the right picks up horizontal edges. Notice how the horizontal lines are gone in the left? That's because if there's a horizontal line, there's no change. By combining information from both the horizontal and vertical changes, bam, we now have a direction of change for each point. Ever thought of where the term color gradient comes from? We can now do some cool things with this information, like be able to identify any circles in our image, like our marble from earlier. But rather than figure out the fancy math for this ourselves, we'll let the neural network do it. If we're willing to get weird for a second, the way artificial neural networks work is very similar to how our own brains process images. Both our brain and the artificial brain will take the edge detectors and feed the results into the next layer, which will detect intersections between edges and will be good at detecting textures and patterns. Those feed into the next layer and the next layer, becoming more and more developed until entire objects can be recognized. Here is the result of using 4 layers of 3 neurons on each of our ASL datasets. Nothing too fancy here because our images are small. So I also ran our marble through the Deep Dream Generator website, which is built using a much larger neural network on plenty of high-resolution photos of many types of objects. It will enhance the patterns or objects it's able to detect. Any interpretation here is trying to mind-read an artificial intelligence, which is as unscientific as it sounds, but I could almost make out a cartoon dog. Google's Inception network was originally trained on lots of dog photos, so the tools to visualize the intermediate layers ended up displaying many dreamlike dog photos. We're almost ready for the next lab. There's just a few more tricks to help us out. Pooling is where we look at all the values in our window and do a simple statistical computation. The most common one is max pooling, where we take the largest value in the window and discard the rest. This trick is especially useful when working with large images because it's a way to shrink images down to a smaller image, and smaller images mean less computation, which is quicker and cheaper. Dropout is another interesting tool which, in a way, reflects ensemble learning. During training, we're going to randomly shut off neurons at a rate we specify, meaning it's unable to learn for that step of training. This prevents overfitting by eliminating over-reliance on any particular input or neuron. Just be careful not to set the rate to 1. Then all the neurons will be shut off and the model won't be able to learn. Here's the network we'll be using in the next lab. We're also going to do something called batch normalization, where we normalize the amount weights change between layers during training. Batch normalization was made to prevent something called internal covariate shift, but turns out it doesn't actually do that. Even so, empirically it seems to help with object detection networks. Ready to get your hands dirty? Let's go!